Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And we want to welcome you to the War on Terror Film Festival. This is the final weekend of what's been a series of incredible films, and what a great way to start this weekend. And after watching Rory Kennedy's amazing film Ghost of Abu Ghraib. But before I go into introducing everyone else, I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name's Ahmed Touage. I'm a journalist myself as well as a filmmaker. And I wanted to introduce you our other guests here with us today. So we have Rory Kennedy, who was the director of the film that we've all just watched. She is a documentary filmmaker, and she's both a director and a producer, and she's made a plethora of incredible films. And she's won numerous awards for them, including an Emmy Award for Ghost of Abu Ghraib, as well as being nominated for an Academy Award for other documentaries she's worked on. I also wanted to introduce Katie Gallagher, who is a senior staff attorney at the Centre for Constitutional Rights, as it says on her little caption below. She's worked on universal jurisdiction and international criminal law cases involving US and foreign officials and torture and other war crimes, and civil actions involving private military corporations and torture at the Abu Ghraib prison. So it's quite important to have her perspective on this. We're expecting Mark Danner to join us. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to make it or not. If he does, I'll introduce him later. And then we'll also be having a video message by Salah El Ajili, who is a former Al Jazeera journalist and was based in Baghdad, but was held as a prisoner himself at the Abu Ghraib prison. So it'll be nice to hear from his perspective how it was during his time there. So firstly, I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I guess we'll start off, because it was your film. We'll start off by asking you, Rory, what inspired you to make this movie to begin with?
Well, I was developing a documentary for HBO at the time about genocide, and the thought behind the film was to make a feature film looking at genocide from the perspective of people who committed genocides, to understand what motivated them to engage in those acts. And as I was developing and researching that project, the photos came out about Abu Ghraib, and the images that were so very, very disturbing and upsetting at the time. I mean, and still today, of course. And I found myself having the same questions about the people who had committed these atrocities at Abu Ghraib that I did of people who committed genocide. And I went back to HBO and I said, I'd like to refocus this and look at the people who had committed these acts at Abu Ghraib and try to understand what motivated them to do such horrible, horrendous, unimaginable things. And HBO was on board with that. And then, so I redirected to make the film about Abu Ghraib, and it was really meant initially to be very much kind of psychologically driven. Why would people commit these acts? And then, as I started interviewing people and asking them why they did what they did, they all said the same thing, which is, I did it because I was told to do it. And so then it shifted in part, not entirely, to be more of an investigative film, as to really find out who told them what, when, and who was responsible, and ultimately the film that hopefully at least some of you saw.
Yeah, I think the question that pops into my head when you've just explained your answer is, I guess, what are those direct parallels that you saw between genocide? Is it the people who are committing the crimes, or the senior peoples, or both?
Well, I didn't end up making that film, so I can't do a deep analysis of kind of the connections between the two. But and I think with genocides, it's there's obviously a range of different kinds of genocides and whatnot and conditions, but what I do know is that there are similar conditions where there's an environment where it becomes, legitimized, that people become dehumanized in the process. And so there are certain commonalities, right, of how you convince a group of people to treat another group in a way that is lesser than them, right? And to justify in your head that they can be stripped of both their legal rights and their humanity. So I think there are certain commonalities.
Yeah. Do you want to give specific examples of some of the genocides that you're working on, or it was kind of just a general film about genocide?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
as I said, I didn't end up. I was in the early phases of
Okay.
developing that
Yeah.
project, and I redirected to Abu Ghraib, and it was 20 years ago, or 15 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. I've just noticed Mark has joined us, so I just want to say thanks for joining us, Mark Danner.
My pleasure.
He's a global foreign policy expert. He's a former war reporter and staff writer at The New Yorker. He's also served on the steering committee, and in 2013 served as a resident curator for the Telluride Film Festival. Following the Abu Ghraib scandal, he authored the book Torture and Truth: America, Abu Ghraib, and the War on Terror. Mark is also a professor at UC Berkeley and Bard College. So thank you for joining us, and I'm
Thank
sure
you,
we're going to learn a lot from your insight as well.
It's good to see you. I'm sorry to be late. Thank you for inviting me.
No, don't apologize. Katie, I want to turn to you because you've worked with some of these prisoners before as an attorney, and so we've heard kind of like the story and seen the images, but none of us have really seen how any of them can get any sort of, I guess, justice. Really, we want to hear from your perspective. Are there any cases that you really stick out in your mind?
Sure. Well, first, really thank you for having me here, and thank you to Rory for making this film. And I appreciate that it expanded out to include also those who were tortured at Abu Ghraib. I think their voices are really important in the story, in the historical story, and obviously they're at the center of what happened, in my opinion. Over the course of the last 17 years, the Center for Constitutional Rights, working with private lawyers, and Susan Burke and Sharif Akil really have been there were there at the very start, leading these cases, helping to bring them to being. We've had 3 cases in which we've represented 338 men, boys, and some women who were held at the Abu Ghraib detention center. Some of them were held also at other detention centers across Iraq. The site that was the focus of the film, and that is the focus of the notorious photos, is of course the hard site. And a number of our plaintiffs were held there during the time that the photos were taken. The cases were filed not against U.S. officials. These are cases that have been brought in U.S. federal court. The first case was filed just weeks after the photos came out. And actually, the first plaintiff came to us before the photos came out. And we were hearing these stories told to us that really just kind of sounded to some as incomprehensible. A lawyer in Sharif, the lawyer in Michigan, met with the first plaintiff, and when he heard the stories, he brought the cases to CCR because by that point we were litigating cases out of Guantanamo, and so we were hearing the stories, and then weeks later, the photos were released and only confirmed what we had been hearing directly from the individuals themselves. These 3 cases have been filed against Titan Corporation, which provided interpreters at Abu Ghraib and other detention centers, and Khaki, which provided interrogators. These three cases have had a long and twisting road through U.S. federal courts. I wish I could say it was fast and easy and that there was justice for our plaintiffs. But unfortunately, we lost the first case, which was filed on behalf of 256 men already back in 2009. Brett Kavanaugh, current Supreme Court Justice, was in the majority of the case of the DC Circuit that rejected that case, finding that there should be something called battlefield immunity, essentially no liability, even when you're suing private corporations that were documented in the government reports as having been complicit in the torture. Merrick Garland, interestingly enough, wrote the dissent in that first case. The second case, brought against Titan, which later changed its name to L3, the interpreters who were very much participants in the torture, especially in the hard site and in the night shift where the most notorious harms happened. We settled that case back in 2011 on behalf of 71 individuals. And then the last case, Al-Shamri V Khaki, and we'll hear from one of the plaintiffs in that case in the video clip. That case we've been litigating since 2008 in the Eastern District of Virginia. We actually had a court date back in 2019, in April 2019, and Khaki, the private military contractor whose interrogators, again, were identified in military reports and were identified in court-martial proceedings as having been instigators in the conspiracy to torture. The company brought its fifth appeal. So we had our trial date of April 2019 put on hold. We went back up to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Ultimately, there was a petition to the Supreme Court by Khaki to review the case, and we are now back before the judge, and we hope finally, a very long way for me to answer this question, that at least three of the victims of Abu Ghraib will have their day in court. There were a number of congressional hearings, military investigations, but they really didn't focus on the individuals at the heart of the story, the men, boys, and women who were tortured and otherwise humiliated, subjected to truly inhumane conditions and treatment. They have not been given the rightful apology, the rightful redress, and reparations that they so readily deserve.
And I think one of the cases you've worked on is Salah al-Ajili. Is that right?
Yes, and he is in this Al-Shamri case against Khaki.
So I think now would be a good time to bring in his story so that we can hear from him directly, in his own words, what his experience was. If we can put the video up.
مرحبا، شكرا لإتاحة الفرصة لي للتحدث عن فيلم أشباح أبو غريب. لا شك أن بعضكم صدموا من الأحداث التي سردها الفيلم، فكل من شاهد الفيلم تلقى هذه الصدمة، وهذه الصدمة برأيي سوف تبقى ولا يمكن أن تزول بمرور الوقت. طيب، أعرفكم بنفسي وقصتي بشكل موجز. أنا صلاح حسن، كنت صحفيا ومنتج أخبار في قناة الجزيرة لغاية عام 2017، وملخص قصتي مع سجن أبو غريب أنني اعتقلت أثناء عملي الصحفي في العراق، وتم زجي في سجن أبو غريب وبقيت هناك نحو شهرين. لم يعاملني حراس السجن على أنني صحفي بطريقة مختلفة كثيرا عن بقية المعتقلين في سجن أبو غريب. تعرضت للضرب ومنع الطعام ومنع النوم والتهديد بالكلاب، وربما الأقسى هي عقوبة خلع الملابس والبقاء عاريا لأيام وفترات طويلة، وغيرها من أساليب التعذيب الجسدي والنفسي. كل ذلك شكل لي صدمة كبيرة لا يمكن أن تمحى من ذاكرتي أبدا، لكن مع ذلك أحاول النسيان والمضي في حياتي. الفيلم عرض حقيقة لا يمكن تكذيبها، وهي الممارسة اللا إنسانية في السجن، لكن في اعتقادي أن الحقيقة لم تكشف بشكل كامل، وما زالت هناك أسرار دفنت وربما.
Pause the video, we can come back to it in a bit. I guess following on from what you said, Katie, I've got a question that's going to, first I want to target towards, ask Rory, and then I'll turn to Mark as well. so one of the things, like when we're talking about justice, and I think this is one of the things that I picked up when watching the film, is it almost feels like there's an ending that's kind of missing that we're expecting to see with this film, that we would hope to see when a story like this comes up. And I guess that ending would be justice. And you kind of point towards that throughout the film, how I guess you mentioned Donald Rumsfeld and how he'd signed like these orders about torture, and you know, one of the memos that he signed, people should be standing for more than 8 hours. Why are we limiting it to just 4, etc.? Do you feel like that kind of ending is missing, that we should, like, I guess maybe want to like produce a follow-up where we can see some sort of justice?
Well, you know, this is documentary. It's not Hollywood, so it landed where it landed, and I agree that it did not land in a just place. So, which is, you know, a disappointment to say the least. I mean, I think that, you know, the film, and I know that one of the questions maybe coming my way is about how the film portrays the people who committed these acts, and do they get off the hook at all? And to me, you know, they don't. The film really profiles and shows the horror of the actions that they engaged in, and you know, the vast majority of them serve time for that, right? And I think what the film also documents is the fact that people who had created the policy, the higher ups, the people in the administration, that none of them served time and had to, you know, pay the price for these actions, which ultimately they bear a significant responsibility for. So I think that's you know, that's remains the story looking back at these events. You know, of course, we've come some way in terms of what we allow and the fact that we don't allow these kinds of acts of torture. But looking back at these events, and, you know, similar to kind of what we're hearing from Katie, is our legal system really doing justice for the people who were tortured? Is it doing justice for the people who created these policies and holding them accountable? And I would say the answer to those two questions is no. But Mark probably has some insights and thoughts.
Yeah, that's obviously, you know, it's funny watching. I was just at the pumpkin patch, where I took my 6 and 8 year old for Halloween festivities. While they were running around searching for pumpkins, I had my little phone up and I was watching the film. And I hadn't seen it since it came out. And I was struck by a couple things. The first was what a good film it is. And I think, Rory, you should be really, you know, proud of it. It's kind of a monumental film and I think a real achievement. The second thing that struck me was really an answer to that question that Ahmed just raised, which is, you know, if you expect there to be a Hollywood ending, there isn't. And the fact is that there were crimes of war committed. Torture was committed under color of law during the War on Terror from almost the beginning, and that it has never been punished. It should have, first of all, been dealt with politically, and the people responsible for making those decisions should have lost their jobs and possibly been prosecuted. That is not even in our world, that possibility. We never came close to it. There have been some civil responses. Rory mentioned you had a handful of the people on the ground who actually served time. But even if you look at the investigations of Abu Ghraib itself, because Abu Ghraib obviously is only one piece of the larger torture puzzle, where you have Guantanamo, you have the dark sites, you have this whole corrupt, violent, bloody, disgusting regime created by the Bush administration under its responsibility, that was responsible for torturing well over 100 people and killing a significant number of them. And those people essentially weren't punished. There was a law passed, Congress passed a law essentially against torture, which will make it harder to do it the next time. I emphasize harder. And if you look at Abu Ghraib itself, you see, I mean, one of the pieces I did after that film, I think, was looking at all the reports that the military did. The military did, I don't know, 11, 9, I can't remember the exact number of reports that they did. Various officers tasked to deal with various sides of it. Well, it was one way of a bureaucracy dealing with this kind of problem, which is you break it up into pieces. So there's, at the end of the day, no real responsibility for it. And none of the decision makers were punished. None. I think Steve Jordan had a letter. I mean, Rory may remember this more than I do, but I think he was the top. Janice Karpinski, of course, lost her job. She wasn't someone in direct line of command, ordering torture. So it was classic that she wasn't responsible, but she lost her job. And meanwhile, there are innumerable people who I think should have been punished or at least lost their jobs who were not. And meanwhile, you had decision makers right up into Dick Cheney and George W. Bush who suffered no consequences whatever. And that includes Rumsfeld. And
Ashcroft.
And Ashcroft, exactly. And the sort of political arms of our government, I mean, eventually Congress passed the McCain Amendment. I mean, I'm fairly skeptical about how effective that would have been. I mean, it's interesting that, Donald Trump came into office saying, why aren't we torturing? That this has now become, if you look at what has happened as opposed to what hasn't happened, what has happened is torture has become the ideology of one of our two political parties. The Republican Party is a pro-torture party. Now, it's interesting that Donald Trump came into office essentially saying, I want to torture and I want to kill families of terrorists. Those were his two ideas when it came to the war on terror. And essentially the military, in the person of General Mattis, said, we're not going to go there. We're not going to go there again. Sorry, we're not going to do it. So you had this institutional pushback. You probably would have had the same pushback in the CIA, although, of course, one of the people who had direct responsibility for torture in the CIA became the DCI, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So far from anybody suffering consequences, I think the period, that Rory covers so well in her film and the aftermath have changed American politics in the other direction. They have made torture possible and a political possibility in American politics and American policy because it was carried out under color of law. And at the end of the day, the decision makers responsible did not suffer a bit for it, not a bit.
And Bush was reelected after these photos came out. But if I could just make one comment on what Mark just said, I think it's important to remember that Iraq was not Guantanamo. The United States recognized that the Geneva Conventions applied in Iraq. The torture statute was already on the books and applied to conduct in Iraq. And so we had law that should have applied to Abu Ghraib that didn't apply to Guantanamo, even though it should have, but as a matter of policy, it didn't. There was black letter prohibition against torture at the time these crimes happened, and still no accountability, and it was still permissible. And I agree, it was still considered a policy option. We had a decision in our Al-Shamri case, the case that Salah, the man in the video that we'll see, is a part of, the case against the contractors. And we had a decision come out in October 2016, which I think is notable. The Fourth Circuit, a judge of the Court of Appeals, said that torture can never be a policy, and no one, not even the President of the United States, can authorize torture. This came out right before the 2016 election, and I think it was a warning sign that, look, we've spent 16 years debating whether torture can be a policy. It can't. It's unlawful under all circumstances, and that a judge in 2016 felt it was important to put that on record. But of course, then we still had Donald Trump come in and say, I'm going to bring back waterboarding and a hell of a lot worse.
Could I add something to that really interesting comment? I originally started writing about human rights when I was in college, and I met Bob Cox, who'd been the editor of the Buenos Aires Herald, and I did a piece about the dirty war in Argentina, which was then going on. And I essentially thought at that time, you know, the United States has done some fairly terrible things in alliance with countries around the world, but it would never do torture under color of law. I kind of thought that, you know, that was absolutely kind of beyond the red line. And one of the things that I felt I learned after the War on Terror is you do have, you know, there's a great book called Constitutional Dictatorship about what happens during wartime. And that though I want to take satisfaction from what the judge in, was it the Fourth Circuit, you said?
Yes.
I want to take satisfaction from that. You know, the Haitians have a phrase which is, constitutions are made of paper, bayonets are made of iron. That when you get into a wartime situation, judges tend to bend over backwards for the military. And really, it's remarkable the extent to which the Supreme Court stood up in different areas during the War on Terror. But in general, it was not, the courts were not a bulwark against torture. And, you know, you had this shift after 9/11 in which the politics pointed one way, and I mean that the political pressure was punish them, invade them, humiliate them. And I think that is a very real, that kind of sentiment, that political sentiment, which was widespread, is a very real part of what happened after 9/11 that we are sort of forgetting now. You know, I was interested when Colin Powell died, that the general impression seemed to be now when it comes to the Iraq War, well, we were lied to. That's why we fought the Iraq War. We were lied to. Colin Powell lied to us. And that's not what happened. Do you know, I mean, I realize these points seem slightly disjointed, but I feel like we're forgetting, in a way, the very real political sentiment after the attacks that led to this kind of behavior. I'm not saying that any administration would have done it. I think a Gore administration wouldn't have done this. But I think there was a real political hatred and sentiment abroad in the land that wanted revenge. And that, you know, the idea of human rights were just, you know, that's not for an emergency. And the problem with human rights is if it doesn't work for an emergency, then it doesn't work at all. You know, it has to apply to an emergency. So I feel like, you know, one of the things we learned is that you can't go to the law for help. You want to. And as I say, the Supreme Court handed down some very creditable decisions in 2006 and 2007. But what interested me is how a society that claims to respect human rights goes back on that so quickly when attacked. And that's really what I felt I learned from this.
I think just to add to that point, Mark, what I found fascinating, especially through this movie, is that and it kind of alludes back to the point you were mentioning before, that yes, kind of the sentiment that was there was people want revenge, but so long as it was done like behind closed doors, as soon as these images came out, that whole sentiment changed. And I think that's what having this movie like going on primetime television on HBO, like winning the awards, brings to light for people who had no idea what was happening in Iraq. And I guess the real question is that Abu Ghraib was one of the stories that we were able to get out there. How many others are there that we haven't heard about, or
Yeah,
maybe never will hear about?
but you know, as was noticed, he was reelected. Like, this happened in the spring of 2004, and torture, you know, the Democrats did not even bring. I covered that campaign. The Kerry campaign did not use this as an issue. Why do you think that was? In other words, why was this not a way to defeat George W. Bush? Why did they not feel that this would have been an effective issue? Because they didn't feel that fundamentally people gave a shit about Iraqis getting tortured and Americans doing the torturing. I don't know, Rory, you may have a different opinion of this, but I think that re-election is critical. Was that after the film?
Was that what?
Was his re-election when did the film come out?
I think his re-election was after the film, but I can't remember honestly.
Before.
It was before.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with you, Mark. I think that you know, it wasn't going to get Kerry the votes.
Yeah, it wasn't.
To focus on this issue, and you know, and I think, I mean, listen, I think there's different tracks that we're talking about. We're talking about the political response to this situation, and I think we've seen over the last few years how, and I think this is true throughout history, that it's advantageous to speak to fear for politicians, and they get votes when they talk about fear. And if it's a fear of refugees, or, you know, fear of terrorists or ISIS, whatever, that's going to get people voting and voting for you. And it's, you know, elected many dictators and right-wing people over many years across many countries. So, you know, fear is a very I think powerful element in our political system. And then I think, you know, the analysis of the courts and when we can rely on them and when we can't. Sometimes the courts, you know, really rise up and do amazing things. And I think we've seen that in other cases over the last few years where they really supported our systems, you know, and then we see them fail us. And I think ultimately it comes back to us as human beings and people watching these events and seeing what's happened and continuing to put the pressure on and to make the demands and to, you know, to write the brilliant things that you're writing, Mark and Katie, to do the work that you're doing and representing people. I hope to be a small piece of that as well with the films that I'm making and the storytelling that we're doing. And Ahmed, you're doing great work with the reporting that you're doing. So, and you know, these festivals and these panels, it's all about getting the information out there and helping people to continue to stand up and make demands. And, you know, our systems don't work without that.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that I picked up on the film was this fear thing that you mentioned as well, and how I guess a lot of the soldiers that were working in the prison, they did have this sense of fear of almost the unknown. They're not really sure what's going on. And I think one of the characters was talking about it and how he said, "Who's the enemy?" He was asking his seniors, "Who's the enemy?" He says, "I've never left America before. I don't know who the enemy is. Everyone looks like the enemy to me because I don't know what they look like." And I actually experienced this myself. I'm originally Iraqi. I've spent time in Baghdad doing some work out there, and I went to I was invited to one of the embassies for an event, and one of the private military personnel out there just looked at me and, as a joke, said, "Oh, look, it's the Taliban." which kind of, if that's the image that they get of someone that looks like me is terrorist, then you can understand that this is that fear that's instilled in them results in things like what's happened in Abu Ghraib and other things like that. But Rory, I wanted to ask you, I guess you must have spent quite a lot of time with these different soldiers and military personnel, and I guess probably I would say quite intimate time hearing their stories. Would you say that they are particularly evil? And the reason I ask this question, and this is when I'm going to ask for the image to be brought up, is we always ask ourselves, like, if we were in Nazi Germany, like it's an age-old question, discussions that happen in university all the time. Would we be the people that would stand up against the Nazis? Because most Germans ended up following suits in the German. And if we could put that image up, there's a famous image that even Isabel Wilkinson talks about it in her book Cast. Do we have the image? Yeah. So where everyone's doing the Nazi salute in Germany, and then there's that one guy who's the guy circled in red who isn't doing it, and we'd all like to think that would be us. Do you think that those soldiers were innately evil, or were they just kind of going along with what everybody else was doing?
I did not feel that these soldiers were innately evil. I when I went in to the process of filmmaking, I thought they must be, but then I met them and spent time with them and understood what they were up against more clearly. There were a handful of them who was like the guy there circled, who ultimately did stand up and say enough is enough and became whistleblowers. But I think for many of these folks, as the film documents, I mean, they were 18, 19 years old. They were very young. They were completely ill-equipped. They had no training. They were thrown into this environment in this case in Iraq, where they were told that they were helping the war on terror by making these people more vulnerable, and so that they could get, really important information out of them. And I think they believe that. I think they believe that, which is why we start the film with the Milgram Experiment, which is not to excuse them, and they absolutely shouldn't have done anything that they did in there. But, I think that there are these institutions that we need to understand how powerful they are and how important they are in terms of impacting human behavior. And the people who are creating these institutionalized systems of torture are really the ones who need to be held account.
Yeah, and I think this, and I want to move to Katie as well. So a lot of the characters that we saw in the film, and these concepts that we're discussing, where it's come from senior officials in government, a lot of the policies on torture, but unfortunately, a lot of the cases that we're holding are against the private companies that were involved. So you mentioned CACI and the other and others. Why is it that we can't touch the US government?
Well, I'll answer it in two ways. I think it's not unimportant to bring the cases against the private military contractors.
Of course. Yeah.
On the contrary, I think it was very important, and that was a choice not because one was necessarily easier than the other, but if we go back to the war in Iraq, which was a war of choice, it was a war that was very much motivated by a financial incentive. It was a war for profit. And that profit included those private military contractors, whether it was the security services, whether it was the contracts to set up military bases, or in the case of Iraq, to provide interrogators and interpreters. We know that there were CIA private contractors paid $80 million to help design the torture program used by the CIA. So this case was intentionally brought to show their role and hold them accountable for that role. And what happened at Abu Ghraib in particular was that there was a command vacuum. This is, again, slightly different than the CIA and Guantanamo scenarios where you had orders to torture. This was no one quite knew, they say, what they were and weren't allowed to do. And into that space where these 18, 19-year-olds that already spoke about, you have privately hired interrogators being paid 2, 3, 4 times as much as the younger MPs or military interrogators, and they take a role in helping to create that system where individuals were tortured. So we felt it was very important to hold them accountable for their role. In terms of the civilian leadership or the military leadership, there should have been greater accountability, no doubt. I am by no means suggesting that they should have been off the hook, whether politically or legally. And in this case, they were in both regards. There are some immunities that can exist for government actors when they are acting in the scope of their employment. And unfortunately, in these torture cases, we've seen that immunity jurisprudence strengthened. And I also just want to kind of de-exceptionalize, if I can, a little bit. What happened at Abu Ghraib, as horrific as it is, we see people being held in solitary confinement, being subjected to torture, I would say, in U.S. prisons. And now we've seen in the detention centers. And there, it's equally difficult to hold government officials accountable. So I think we do have real issues with immunity and ultimately impunity, and really do need to revisit our laws. Again, in this case that I'm litigating, the Al-Shamri V Khaki case down in Virginia, in addition to the decision I mentioned in 2016, where an appeals court judge said, you can't torture, a president can't order it, it's illegal. Our judge hearing the case in Alexandria, Judge Brinkema, recently ruled that the United States could not have immunity for what happened at Abu Ghraib, again, citing the fact that it is illegal, unlawful. And so I think there are questions as to whether or not you could hold the United States accountable. But again, we just felt in this case it was important to hold the private military contractors accountable for their role in this.
Mark, I just want to turn to you as well. I think the Iraq War in particular was, I guess, one of those decisions by the U.S. Army where they tried to detach themselves a lot. So it wasn't just the prisons that they ran there. Even some of the security on the streets in Baghdad were run by private military companies like Blackwater and things like that. What was the reason for what was the, I guess, the greater objective for the American Army to, I guess, devolve some of the responsibility to these private companies?
Well, the major reason was they didn't have enough troops, that Rumsfeld insisted that the numbers would be, the military, there's famous controversy, obviously, where the chief of staff of the army Shinseki said that they needed several 100,000 troops to occupy Iraq. Rumsfeld believed the number was more like 120,000 and less. He wanted to essentially be out. The invasion happened in March. He wanted to be out, almost entirely out, in September. That was the original plan. So, they essentially didn't plan for an occupation because they thought they could get away without an occupation. And as it became obvious that they couldn't extract themselves this way, rather than asking for more troops, which was not only politically fraught, but was difficult to manage simply because of the number of troops that are in the U.S. military. It was much easier to use money than it was to use troops. I think that's a general universal answer that I think is accurate. It should be said that a lot of these private contractors were simply special forces troops and other people who just left and became, put on their private hats and earned 3 times as much. But they'd never had enough troops to secure Iraq. I mean, that's a simple fact of the Iraq War, that even in the so-called surge, which was years later, they never had enough troops to secure the country. And they certainly didn't have enough at the beginning, when the widespread looting, which was, has never been appreciated here, I think, how that undermined the occupation, undermined America's reputation, undermined the whole so-called liberal project in Iraq of making democracy there. That looting came about essentially because there weren't enough troops on the ground, and it destroyed the country. It destroyed its institutions. All of the government ministries were looted. The university was looted. People's, many well-off people, their houses were looted. It was a major cataclysm for many, especially the upper class in Iraq, the upper Sunni class. It doomed the occupation. So anyway, to get back to the question, I think this idea from the beginning that we're going to go in and we're going to get out, we're going to be lethal, we're going to be mobile, we're going to be lean. All of Rumsfeld's ideology was put to test in Iraq, and it was insane. It was not, it wasn't some sort of happenstance that it failed. It failed because it was doomed to fail, because they didn't have enough troops. And if you're going to invade, you have to occupy the place. People in the military knew this. So the idea that it was, oh my gosh, the war failed. It was quite predictable that the war would fail. I predicted, a lot of other people predicted it.
The interesting fact that sticks in my head, and that's written in Toby Dodge's book, is when America first invaded Iraq, they didn't go in with a single Arabic-speaking soldier, and that kind of just puts it into perspective how underprepared they were for such a feat.
Absolutely. The one thing to add here is there was a real ideological charge in this invasion, which again is hard to remember now. We are the greatest power the world has ever seen. This is the unipolar moment. We have no rivals on the world stage. We can use our power to change the world. There really were people in positions of power who believed this fervently. And, they, in a sense, they didn't believe in material things, that, in order to occupy the country, you need this many troops and you need to do this and that and that. They had some very inflated idea that was really, at the end of the day, ideological. And ideology, you can't do everything with the military. Napoleon had a phrase, it's attributed to him: you can do everything with a bayonet except sit on it. And it sounds ridiculous, but he meant that you can't, you can destroy things with the military, but building things is a lot harder. Staying there, creating institutions, you can't do that. And they didn't want to believe that.
I think because I'm also conscious of the time, I just want to quickly talk about some of the victims as well of that suffered the torture and abuse in the prisons. How difficult was it finding people willing to speak out, Rory? And how difficult were those conversations that you were having with them?
Well, it was difficult, and it took a lot of research to find them, and also to find people who were comfortable talking with us. A lot of them were in Iraq, and it was hard to communicate at that time. And ultimately, we were able to find a handful of people who were willing to speak with us. None of them wanted to speak to us in Iraq. And so then we offered to fly them to Turkey. And I met them in Turkey, and that was very complicated. And some of them were stopped at the airport in Iraq, and others were stopped in Turkey. And there was, and two of them couldn't ultimately get out of Iraq. Anyway, so it was hard, it was hard to kind of coordinate it all. And then we ended up doing the interviews in a hotel in Turkey. And the interviews themselves, listen, I think for all of these folks, they were horrendously tortured, and it's, it was very post-traumatic stress symptoms that they had. And, I think talking about these events is very hard. And I'm very conscious of asking people to do that because I think it brings up a lot of issues and is very difficult to process. But I think they also felt that it was important to get their story out and that there was really a sense that, people hadn't really heard their voices or seen them speak. And it was really important to me to include their voices in the film and to understand what it means to be tortured. And to understand the people that were doing it to, and to humanize them, because, that's part of the process that happens, is the dehumanizing and the kind of fear that's projected onto these folks. So, I really appreciated their willingness to speak to me and their bravery to travel, to do it, and their commitment to it. I mean, they really had to lean into this and decide this was important to them, right? Mm-hmm. And to trust when I told them, this is how I'm going to tell this film and this is the story I'm going to tell, that I was telling the truth. I mean, that's like, it's a lot to get somebody in that situation to come to that point where they're willing to do it. And I'm thinking back on it, and I can't believe they did it. It's extraordinary courage and bravery, just the act alone of speaking to me, my God. But, I think it's a really important part of the overall story that we told in the film and the overall story of what happened. So I'm happy that they were willing.
Could I add something to that, Ahmed? That watching the film again, I found intensely moving the interviews with the Iraqis, particularly the man who lost his father. And I really think that one of the achievements of the film in retrospect, this would be a different analysis than I would have had at the time, is the way it refuses to other people. First of all, the young soldiers who are talked to, there is no way to conceive them as evil. They're very much these human beings who come across very strongly as human beings who are in this pressured situation. And the pressures came from several of the, aspects I talked about a second ago, which is that there was no preparation, there was no equipment, there was no anything, there was no plan. And they were the ones who bore this. And I really admired how Rory brought that out through them as human beings. There was nothing evil about them. And the same thing with the Iraqis, that we have this tendency, we go into these countries and we kill all these people, and it's at a distance, and we don't really see them as Americans. And I thought in particular, the account of the man whose father died, I just found wrenching and horrible. And, the Americans saying, "Get back. If you come here again, I'll shoot you." And there was something so simple and so overwhelmingly powerful about it. I just found it, and I didn't even frankly remember it from when I first saw the film. So my second viewing of it was a lot different than the first. And I really admired, I guess I'm talking about the humanism of the film. I mean, there's something deeply human about it that's achieved in the film that I really admired.
Yeah, and I think that's what one of the important takeaways from the film is. Like, there's been other films produced about Iraq which treats Iraqis as just numbers. I think I would say like American Sniper is a classic, where even Chris Carl, if you read his book, how he would keep a tab of how many people he's killed. So they were literally just numbers. So I guess thank you for bringing those voices. And I think it's important that we do hear some of the voices. And I think they've got the video ready for us to see of Salah Al-Ajili, if we can see it quickly. And then I know Rory's got to go shoot off soon after. So can we play the video?
مرحبا، شكرا لإتاحة الفرصة لي للتحدث عن فيلم أشباح أبو غريب. لا شك أن بعضكم صدموا من الأحداث التي سردها الفيلم، فكل من شاهد الفيلم تلقى هذه الصدمة، وهذه الصدمة برأيي سوف تبقى ولا يمكن أن تزول بمرور الوقت. طيب، أعرفكم بنفسي وقصتي بشكل موجز. أنا صلاح حسن، كنت صحفيا ومنتج أخبار في قناة الجزيرة لغاية عام 2017. وملخص قصتي مع سجن أبو غريب أنني اعتقلت أثناء عملي الصحفي في العراق، وتم زجي في سجن أبو غريب وبقيت هناك نحو شهرين. لم يعاملني حراس السجن على أنني صحفي بطريقة مختلفة كثيرا عن بقية المعتقلين في سجن أبو غريب. تعرضت للضرب ومنع الطعام ومنع النوم والتهديد بالكلاب، وربما الأقسى هي عقوبة خلع الملابس والبقاء عاريا لأيام وفترات طويلة، وغيرها من أساليب التعذيب الجسدي والنفسي. كل ذلك شكل لي صدمة كبيرة لا يمكن أن تمحى من ذاكرتي أبدا، لكن مع ذلك أحاول النسيان والمضي في حياتي. الفيلم عرض حقيقة لا يمكن تكذيبها، وهي الممارسة اللا إنسانية في السجن، لكن في اعتقادي أن الحقيقة لم تكشف بشكل كامل، وما زالت هناك أسرار دفنت وربما لن يكشف النقاب عنها. هناك معتقلين ماتوا أثناء التعذيب ولم تعرف قصصهم. هناك شركات أمنية وضعت خططا للتعامل مع المعتقلين، مثل أساليب التعذيب الجسدي والنفسي، ومارستها بنفسها على المعتقلين، لكنهم أي هذه الشركات بقوا بعيدا عن المساءلة. مع ذلك هذه الأفلام تفضح الجرائم، فهي دليل لا يندثر ويبقى للأجيال القادمة حتى يطلعون عليها. بعد مضي سنوات قلت مع نفسي: لما لا أوثق ما جرى معي في سجن أبو غريب من خلال رواية أو سيرة ذاتية؟ وفعلا بدأت العمل على ذلك. كتبت كثيرا عن قصص مختلفة جرت أحداثها أمامي. قصة فاطمة الفتاة المعاقة ذهنيا، والتي لا يتجاوز عمرها 12 عاما، والتي اعتقلت للضغط على شقيقها المتهم كي يسلم نفسه للقوات الأمريكية. وقصة بكاء ونحيب النساء المعتقلات في الليل داخل الزنزانات، وقصص أخرى. ولكن عندما آتي لسرد أحداث جرت معي شخصيا تخونني الكلمات وأتعثر، فلا أستطيع الوصف ولا الكتابة وأتوقف. في عام 2008 سنحت فرصة لرفع دعوى قضائية ضد شركة أمنية كان لها دور كبير في سجن أبو غريب، وبالفعل رفعنا الدعوى، ومنذ ذلك الوقت لم نحقق نتيجة. فالشركة الأمنية تتنصل وتتملص، وتارة تستخدم قوتها السياسية للتأثير على سير الدعوة. مع ذلك نحن مستمرون حتى تعترف الشركة بجريمتها. وأعتقد أن الزميلة كاتي، وهي معكم الآن، ربما ستتحدث عن القضية القانونية بشكل أفضل مني. اليوم أعتقد أن أقل ما يمكن فعله من جانب كل من شارك في التعذيب في سجن أبو غريب بشكل مباشر أو غير مباشر هو الاعتراف الكامل والكشف عن كل الحقائق والجهات التي شاركت في هذه المأساة. ولا يكفي معاقبة بضعة حراس ظهروا في الفيلم كأنهم نادمون، وما فعلوه بالأمس كان مجرد تصرف ذاتي ليس له علاقة بالجهات العليا. شكرا جزيلا لكم.
Yeah, so that was some very chilling words from Salah, and I guess a reminder for us of how important it is to have these stories come out there so that we know what was happening. And you know, I guess what happened in Abu Ghraib wasn't just a one-off incident. It was happening in multiple prisons across Iraq, and I guess Abu Ghraib is the one that we became most familiar with, thanks to the images, thanks to the film being produced, and it's also important to remember that these prisons only made things worse for Iraqis and sometimes pushed ordinary Iraqis towards extremism. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was held at that prison, as we remember, and a lot of people have said these kind of prisons became incubator hubs for terrorism. And I know the time is running short, so I wanted to see if everyone's got some last minute words they wanted to have. Rory, if you want to start by giving us like any closing thoughts that you may have.
Well, you know, Morg, thank you for what you said and everybody, but I appreciate your nice reflections on the movie. I mean, I think that in this day and age and kind of looking back at these events that we do have to remind ourselves always of the humanity of of everybody in this world, right? And we don't agree with everybody, and you know, there's people coming from different perspectives, and have had different experiences. And I think that we always have to remind ourselves of trying to look out for each other and try to see, something human in all of us and in people who we might fear or think ill of, and to try to find some warmth, some love, some connection, no matter what the circumstance.
Thank you so much, Rory. And again, thank you so much for making the film even to begin with, and bringing it, I guess, to the mainstream. Such a powerful film. And I think I share the sentiment with everyone that's watched it. It really does bring to light a story that we may never have heard about before, and hopefully bring some element of justice towards the people that suffered. Mark, did you have any final thoughts before we?
I would say that, I covered the Capitol coup, however many months ago that was. And I guess I'm astonished the older I get at the power of forgetting. That, there are obviously active forces that are pushing us to forget in the case of the Capitol coup, and to re-see it, to see it a different way. But I was very struck watching this film, thinking that, when I took part in it, I thought, well, it's important to document this. This is critical to do this. But looking at it again, I really thought, this is a slice of history. This is something that is alive. And that watching it now really returned me to that time and returned me to events that have really dimmed in my memory. And I guess I'm changing in my attitude of what this activity we do, that Rory does, that I do, that journalists do, and that also Katie does in a different way, the value of it, which is, it's a kind of putting an ice axe into this slippery slope down which we all fall and forget. It's a terrible metaphor, but it's kind of holding on. And I just found in watching the film, I mentioned a second ago that Colin Powell, the stuff that was said after he died, it kind of shocked me. I just thought, really? That's what happened with Iraq? We were lied to? Americans were lied to. That's the story of the war. Because I don't think that was the story of the war at all, And watching this film and seeing the way it puts together these sort of blithe, innocent Americans, and this man who lost his father, and these people who are damaged in this lasting way, I was extremely grateful for it. I thought this is something that will last, that will not change. Memory won't change it. It's a document that breathes its time. So it gave me a different appreciation for what we do and what we're fighting against, which is the power of forgetting, which I think is getting stronger all the time. It feels that way anyway.
I think there's quite a famous quote by a famous author, Arundhati Roy, who says, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. It's just the conveniently unheard." And I think this film kind of summarizes that, because these prisoners were literally screaming at the top of their lungs. So it's not that they didn't have a voice. Their voice was there. It's just that we had turned a blind eye. And it was only until those images popped up, films started to be made, that we did actually start paying attention. And that's why I feel media is such an important tool that I guess we have seen become more and more powerful recently. And Katie, do you have any final words?
Yeah. Well, first, I really do want to end where I started, and that's thanking Rory for making the film. I'm doing a lot more talks these days to high school and college students, including about Abu Ghraib, and they don't know about it. They are shocked. They are disturbed. They are horrified that this was done in their name. And I can only hope that as we move out of that moment, that fear moment, that they will really say, no, this is not something that we can ever go back to. So I think this film is important to have out there, as well as photos by Chris Bartlett, who took photos of our plaintiffs as well. But the last thing I really want to end on is the hope that the voices of our plaintiffs one day make it into the courtroom. They have stories that have yet to be fully heard. We are now at trial. If we get to trial, it will just be 3 of the 338 that I've represented, which is, of course, far from the total number of Iraqis who were tortured by Americans after the invasion. But I hope that the American public has the opportunity to hear their stories in their words, on their terms, in a U.S. courtroom. Thus far, the United States has not granted visas to our plaintiffs. So for all the talk of, yes, we're very sorry what happened to them, it has most definitely not been an easy path to justice. And whether it's in the court or whether it may be in Congress, looking back 20 years on, that they finally have some kind of hearings where it's not just the military that we're hearing from, but the actual individuals who were subjected to torture. I hope that they have their day to truly have their voices heard. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, that you're all so amazing. And I just also want to go back to Mark to just, I mean, we're all in this together, but I could never have made that film without the work and the journalism and the extraordinary focus that you had on this issue, Mark. And I'm just so grateful that you're continuing to do the work that you did way back then and continue to do now. And Katie, you're extraordinary too, and the work that you're doing representing people who otherwise continue to have a hard time having their voices heard and represented and getting justice served. So thank you. And Ahmed, to you too, and your journalism and helping to pull this panel together, and appreciate everybody here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you for having this discussion after so many years of the film being made, the incidents happening, and refreshing it back to our memories. So thank you all, and hope everyone stays safe.
All right, you take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.
See ya.
Bye.